Hello, everybody. Yesterday, yesterday, the audience was told that I need no introduction. So here you go. Here you go. But thank you. No. Just one thing before we launch. If you can get yourselves to Aix-en-Provence this summer, there's a Cézanne festival starting in June, including an exhibition at the Musée Granet, reopening of the Cézanne house and studio after years of renovations, and also the Quarry where he painted. And there's an opera festival as well. So just Google Cézanne 2025. Google 2025 and you'll get the whole program. We ended the first lecture with Cézanne in his early 40s, painting landscapes in his native south in Provence. I want to just flash back a minute, 20 years to Paris. While Manet and Monet and Degas struggled for acceptance by juries for the official Salon exhibitions and had these works refused, Cézanne more or less trained himself. He had a rebellious streak, and he cultivated it. He even projected it. And one of his friends growing up called him that poetic, fantastic, magic, erotic, antique, physical, geometrical friend of ours. He absorbed outdoor painting techniques working in the countryside near Paris, coached by his mentor and fellow radical Camille Pissarro, there at the bottom, who painted Cézanne's portrait at the top, every inch the proletarian art worker. Their work is sometimes not so easy to tell apart. The curator, Joseph Rischel, wrote this: their mutual influence over 10 years is one of the great chapters in the history of 19th century painting. At the beginning, the sage Pissarro endeavored to calm the ferocious young Cézanne, but as time passed, Cézanne progressively found himself in the lead, encouraging the older artist to follow his example in testing the limits of Impressionist landscape painting. In his choice of landscape motifs, Cézanne was full of surprises. At the left, you get a slice of farmyard confined by two high, unexplained walls. It's hardly the ingratiating, picturesque view that we expect. At the right, a dizzying complexity of a wooden bridge and stone piers and their patchwork reflections under a canopy of leaves that he painted with short parallel strokes, a technique that we saw him use over and over at this period. We looked at Cézanne portraits of friends. On the right, thickly painted, and on the left, again, withdrawn, both of them almost evasive, but painted in a very fluent and lively way. Something similar happens in still life, a dozen years apart. On the right and earlier, darker and more emphatic, and then at the left, too colorful and delicately balanced. And we arrived here at the end of the first lecture with Cézanne drawn back to Provence, where he was going to spend much of his time in the 1880s, and practically all of it during his last 15 years. This is the fishing village of L'Estaque, not very far from his family house in Aix-en-Provence. Life was difficult as he reached his mid-40s. His paintings had their admirers, but since he had hardly exhibited, there weren't very many viewers and still fewer buyers. In Paris, he was often ridiculed as a rude provincial or avoided. His patient mistress hadn't yet become his wife. That was going to happen in 1886. And the situation with his parents and his siblings at the family house in Aix was uneasy. His rich banker father died in 1886, however, making Paul's finances easier. But his famous childhood friend, Émile Zola, published a novel called L'Œuvre, the masterpiece, in which Cézanne is the unmistakable model for Zola's unsuccessful avant-garde painter who dies a suicide. So this ended the relationship and put an end to his visits to Zola in the suburbs of Paris, here, where he had painted this wonderful shimmering view across the river to the village and the castle of Médan. This is a moment to add that although we saw Cézanne had moved away from Pissarro, and although Cézanne's technique had evolved into something quite distinct, those short parallel diagonal strokes, the two of them are still in touch. For example, when Cézanne paints this large woodland scene, he's still using a whole repertory of different kinds of strokes, the kind of characteristic impressionist variety. But the lesson of Cézanne's technique sticks with Pissarro, and he can use it when he needs it. For example, here on the right, this is Pissarro's picture. Look at the leaves here. You recognize them. In the late 1880s, though, something entirely new arrives in Paris, a system of painting that sacrifices impressionist dazzle and impulse and subjective untidiness for something else, something of optical science. This was Georges Seurat's method of using small dots of related or contrasting colors to recreate in the eye of the beholder something of the experience of bright light and very subtle gradations of shade. Pretty soon after this picture, the Grand Château was exhibited. Seurat had attracted some followers, including Pissarro, who was in his late 60s, but still open-minded enough to give it a try. And he became enthusiastic and patient and good at it. Patience with this technique is definitely a virtue. Pissarro taught it to his Dutch protege, Vincent van Gogh, whom you know, who used it for some months in Paris before it got so laborious for him that he dropped it. The same happened with Pissarro. But there were others, believers in pointillism, divisionism, including the very successful Paul Signac on the right and his protege, Henri Matisse, on the left, working just 90 miles away in Saint-Tropez. Matisse resisted the uniform dot technique, and he could have compromised with it in this sketch for a picture of a picnic on the left. Then he went for it in this finished version that in 1905 he helped to make his reputation in Paris as what the critics called a wild beast. One critic called a fauve, but that's another story. It's also the end of this little off-road excursion into alternative painting techniques during Cézanne's lifetime. So, meanwhile, Cézanne would have no use for pointillism. He did hope for recognition, but he loathed the Paris art world. His remedies were retreat, withdrawal from Paris to Provence for frequent and lengthy periods, and of course, total absorption in his work. The decade of the 1880s and 90s is when he found locales for austere Provençal subjects, mostly inland, around Aix, and the ways of recording them that he's best known for. This is a view from the family property, now with gray-green leaves on chestnut trees and drying patches of short grass on the fields, stepping down into the distant buildings and hills. The detail shows you that Cézanne is still experimenting with brushstrokes that are regular, but changing direction and degree of saturation to produce light and shade. In the winter, conditions called for a different technique, partly translucent, like watercolor, letting the tree trunks and the bare branches do this kind of dance in the foreground, and revealing the blue shape of the mountain that we'll be seeing a lot more of, Mont Sainte-Victoire. Vincent van Gogh, who spent 2 years not far from here, wrote to his brother Theo that Cézanne's painting showed the harsh side of Provence. That seems true here. Dry, stony, abrupt, and also dizzying. You don't see right away where you're standing or the path that would get you all the way up that slope. But you do find it climbing across at the bottom, disappearing behind those overlapping blades of shadow that fan out at the bottom left, seemingly from that green hub-like thing, and point us up the path. The buildings there sit securely, but with no signs of human or animal life. That's typical of Cézanne's landscapes, but the shapes are active, quirky, and not in exact, strict perspective. What's striking is the contrast of the flat stucco of the buildings to the shivery surfaces of the landscapes all around them, the most elaborate in all his work. Look at how the smooth walls contrast with the outcrop below. 3 layered steps, which he paints with short diagonals, changing colors all across, from white and gray and ochre strokes at the left, in and out of shadows, all the way around to dark gray and black at the right. He slips in strokes of contrasting color among the predominant ones, giving the areas different shifts of light or shade or tint. Below the outcrop, a row of greens and blues and ochres and some dry, twisty branches cavorting. Another seemingly abandoned house below the long ridge of Mont Sainte-Victoire is here. The blue slopes above, to do those, he can revert, when he needs to the techniques he'd been using with watercolor. That is just darker washes over middle tones. He set up his easel in a field outside the hill town of Gardanne, a few miles south of Aix, and showed its buildings climbing up in a kind of jumble of blocks and slanting roofs. He also lugged his easel higher up to spots where he composed 2 quite different views, neither of them fully finished, but evidently put aside for another time, as he sometimes did, times that often never came. The appeal of the town for Cézanne was the surge upward of the buildings. Mostly, they are just vernacular buildings built and rebuilt over the centuries into a sort of lively, unplanned pileup of man-made geometries. Cézanne found other places within a few miles from here that took his imagination, some of them simply along the road. His interest was both artistic and geological. Here it's a rocky bank by the road, probably cut for building stone, and left looking a bit like a miniature village with red roofs. He's drawn to the geometry of the rocky bank, all of those repeated diagonals that are picked up in the hills above, in the roofs and in the fields. And they're separated from the wall by a screen of vigorous young trees. Cézanne said, "For me to paint a landscape well, I need first to discover its geological foundations." He painted it here with the utmost care, not simply to depict it knowledgeably, but to put across how it felt to him, what sensations and associations it aroused in him. And that would have included, I think, some amusement at these visual rhymes that he came upon and made it the subject of his own visual poem. Now, I'm going to take you away from the dazzling light of Provence for a moment and go north with Cézanne to a very different locale that fascinated him and that he painted on several visits. This was the forest of Fontainebleau, near Barbizon, the cradle of modern landscape painting. It stirred his poetical imagination. But what Cézanne chose to paint was nothing conventionally sylvan and peaceable. It's a dusky scene of boulders. Meyer Shapiro described this picture as the vision of a hermit in despair. There's nothing and nobody to give us a sense of scale either, just some spindly pines, sky dimmed by clouds, and the amazing rocks jostling. Cézanne painted them with sort of soft, surprise colors. I mean, look at the long rock in the middle, squashed with orange and green and blue zones, end to end, all over the spectrum. This is an aspect of the Fontainebleau forest that we don't often see illustrated. The 15 square miles of sandstone eroded into huge rocks, where Cézanne, who was there, by the way, at the bottom, was able to find a soft spot in some ferns. It's not the relatively hospitable terrain that Corot had painted, where it's easy to find a picnic spot. You try that in Cézanne's picture. And it's not any of the famous oak trees like the Bodmer oak, named after the artist Carl Bodmer, who painted them. That Monet here painted in gorgeous dappled light. What interested Cézanne instead of that was a kind of prehistoric condition. Ancient boulders as host to some recent vegetation that must have fed his meditation on the sequences of primordial forces that brought all this about. These thoughts had been on his mind for much of his life. Back in Provence, these geological sequences were well understood, and the rock itself had been exploited for centuries, harvested in quarries like this one, called Bibémus, where you could see what was left behind. I realized that humans had been occupying only the thinnest layer lying at the top of eons of sedimented rock. Here's a map that could have hung on the wall of one of Cézanne's classrooms in Aix. The various layers of the region around Aix had been studied and mapped in detail and color-coded by strata. Inside the blue oval, the top, is Aix. In the middle of the oval, in gray, running all the way to the right, is the long ridge of Mont Sainte-Victoire. In between are most of the places we're seeing in Cézanne's pictures. I put a little blue circle down below at the hill town that you saw of Gardanne. L'Estaque on the sea is way out of the picture, far down to the lower left. A close school friend of Cézanne's had, in the meantime, become a pioneer in geology and paleontology, the study of fossil remains of prehistoric humans who had lived in caves there. Like the studies, like Lyell's Principles of Geology and Darwin's publications on evolution, these subjects were all a matter of topic of general interest and excitement even in educated French circles. And Cézanne painted that geologist friend of his, Antoine Fortuné-Marion, the man in the center, and their mutual friend and poet, Anthony Vallabrègue, in their 20s, here at the bottom, before setting off down the coast at L'Estaque, examining strata deposited by millions of years of silting and then erosion, all of that beneath the relatively recent layers of animal and human habitation. Cézanne made drawings of what he saw and small paintings like this one up at the upper left. Near his family house, there was a ridge recently cut through by railroad builders. It was a textbook cross-section of geologic history, and Cézanne made this large painting of it. Further up the valley, other people had been cutting into the rock for profit. This again is the Bibemus Quarry, and here Cézanne paints it in strong sunlight, a deep pit with orangey red sandstone walls, mostly filled with giant rocks, bleached blue-gray at the top, and big trees. His spots of red and yellow make it dazzle. The short strokes give it energy and coherence. You look at the clusters of rounded forms in the center, and you stop wondering what they're supposed to represent. In another of these views at the right side, there's a kind of double take. Is that a ruined tower at the right with windows? No, it is rock left standing after everything else was removed or fell down. What kind of event could cause all this colossal mess? The trees try to hide it, but they don't. Another view is positively scary, the one you saw. Now we can see what made the rocks collapse. People did, with drills and saws. In the upper right, the quarrymen have removed some rectangular blocks, and what remains is an immense central pillar and some precariously poised slabs. And right across the middle, a sort of sweeping arc that's collected stray blocks that seem to be having their own conversations. Down below, there's a glimpse of a more colossal rubble. A few years earlier, another great painter, working just 30 miles away at Saint-Rémy, tried to convey the elemental strangeness of a quarry, this one with a watery grotto. Unlike Cézanne, Van Gogh locates the quarry by surrounding it by a heaving landscape that he creates with these incessant curving brushstrokes. Van Gogh, who was a dozen years younger, may actually have met Cézanne in Paris a couple of years before. They shared a dealer of sorts, the paint merchant Julien Tanguy, a man with tolerance for difficult artists and credit too. The painter Émile Bernard reported this slightly fishy-sounding story, which is still too good not to repeat. One afternoon, when Cézanne came up to Paris, Vincent, who had lunched there, met him at Tanguy's. They chatted together, and after having talked about art in general, they started on their own individual ideas. Van Gogh could not explain his theories better than by showing his pictures to Cézanne and by asking his opinion of them. He brought out canvases of various kinds, portraits and still lifes, landscapes. Cézanne, whose nature was timid but violent, said, after inspecting them all, "Truly, you paint like a madman." In this view on the right, we get an idea of what it would be like to walk the path and be enveloped. Nina Athanasoulou, who has written very helpfully about Cézanne's Provençal works, pointed out that the strange shape of the intruding rock face was made by a quarryman with a mechanical saw. The contrast with the exuberant life of the foliage is pretty violent, and she describes the brushstrokes beautifully, I think. A masterful demonstration of Cézanne's application of hatching, parallel diagonal strokes, that is, both constructed and deconstructed solid forms into dematerialized, evanescent, vibrant surfaces. Painted in patches of thin striations of green and yellow, the pine trees shimmer from underneath their invisible atmospheric curtains of heat and sunlight. Well, you can go there, actually, or will be able to get some of that feeling yourself. The quarry is open to the public, but you better check first, and you probably will need a ticket this summer to get in, because quarrying started up again for a little while during World War II. The rocks are very different now, and the trees have grown, but you can go along a path that passes the little cabin that Cézanne rented to store his easel and canvases, and you can go out on the platform and see with a very good view of the mountain. The great painting in Baltimore has us looking across the quarry in a composition where the bulk of the mountain seems to echo the upthrust of the bulging left-hand pillar of the quarry wall, and seemingly pushed up by the converging pines at the left and framed by the tall tree at the right edge. Up closer, you can see at the right a couple of big discs, as though they were millstones cut and abandoned. It's an image of superhuman forces at work across immeasurable time, right up through our own human interventions, and even to lowly, persistent plant life. Well, enough of rocks for now. Let's talk about trees. One of the beloved subjects for 19th century landscape painters and collectors was the so-called sous-bois, a shady scene in the woods under spreading branches with canopies of leaves and soft spotted light on the forest floor. Here's Pissarro again. And at the right, another important protege of his, Paul Gauguin. But I'm pretty confident that nobody had ever seen a sous-bois like this one. I mean, the tall format is unusual even for Cézanne. There's no bosky landscape and shady undergrowth, just a hill, but with a lot going on up above, the snaky trunks and spiky branches, a kind of wild dance of limbs flung out, wearing wispy fronds of green, and every tint of green, really, shot through with light. Shrubs and grass below are buzzing with muted color and put down in quick, short strokes. The picture is one of a kind, and I think it deserves a long, slow look. Even a trip to Los Angeles, where it is. Here the trees are better behaved. This is San Francisco, by the way. Here the trees are better behaved. And the scene is probably also in Provence, a kind of syncopated march of pines that have grown up straight among the boulders that Cézanne painted with firm outlines and delicate translucent colors. And then finished by scribbling a black shadow in the deep crevices. Where he needs to get some added vibrancy, he uses the familiar diagonal hatchings that you recognize from the quarry. And to give life to the sky, he puts yellow between the branches. Now a different proposition, a rock pile. There's no land on either side to explain its situation, but a mass of rocks surging upward toward a blue sky and supporting tall trees that reach even higher. The feeling is different from the slopes of the Château Noir, which you'll see in a minute, where the cliffs above have sent boulders down. Here there's no explanation for the pile. and no sense of crushing gravity either. Nothing slapdash or even speedy about it. Nothing impressionist. It's built at the right with blunt white wide strokes of white and gray, carefully applied, and in the center and left, a kind of jittering mass of diagonals. Look at the right side again. The pines aren't detailed, they're just summarized by a great mass of green. He didn't need more. Some eloquent trees painted by themselves, minus rocks, a pair of them, both of a certain age, weathered and bent and broken off here and there. In between them, farther back, a perfectly straight, slim tree, evidently much younger. In the watercolor study, he gives the trees close attention, adjusting the contours and making discrete indications of color and shading. Then he takes an upright canvas and paints the trees on a patchwork of ground, moving them closer together. He copies the left-hand tree pretty closely in the painting and applies a few new twists to the branches, including a couple of them at the very top, reaching across one to the other and almost to the point of touching. The effect in the painting, combined with the repeated outlines and the splashes and dashes of the leaves, the effect is of commotion, something like the trees in the LA picture. Trees have associations for Cézanne. He feels the wonder and excitement of their life as he looks at them. That sensation, in his own words, is what he labors to pass on. Even if the product looks untidy or incomplete, I think I would go a step further, and I say that I think he's inviting us to make our own human associations with those trees, the couple, the exuberant limbs coming together, the upright young tree in between. You could say, and I do say, he makes them alive like us, well-worn, vigorous, and in the presence of a successor. A quick footnote on trees at this moment. Here's what Cézanne's friend and admirer, Camille Monet, was painting near Giverny. And here, at about the same time, a river view by Cézanne, probably also painted on one of those same rivers in the north. You can see that Cézanne didn't start with a cluster, with a graceful, planned, unified composition the way Monet did. But instead, he began with the houses and boats in their forms reflected in wildly broken up in the center. He worked outward. The trees were going to be the main thing in his picture, bending with the wind, more or less in unison, but they're all improvised, and he clearly didn't finish it. With that, I want to go back to the portraits that Cézanne has been painting in Paris and Provence during these last dozen years. Cézanne's portrait sitters in his early years were all his friends and all men, except for his companion, Hortense. You've seen this man a few times already, with gently inclined posture and an expression that seems reflective. He painted this not long after this notorious portrait, which he had submitted to the Salon jury, basically defying them to accept it. It's another artist friend of his in Aix, a man with a quick and sensitive mind who was deformed at birth. Cézanne posed him frontally, regally even, in an armchair as though it were a throne, and his feet on a stool as though he were royalty, and above his head his name in an inscription, like a grandee, but with his profession, painter, in stencil letters, like a tradesman. Cézanne drew him twice, two soulful heads with a sort of 17th century flavor, like Van Dyck. By sticking it to the salon jury, Cézanne got some of the attention he wanted, but from a cartoonist. He's shown as a wild man with a nude painting pinned to his ear and brandishing his portrait of Empereur. You saw Cézanne at the left at the beginning of his career, using a palette knife and thick oil paint to present himself as a rough customer, somebody not to be trifled with. A dozen years later, the picture on the right, he's still wary, and the painting technique is still rough-ish, still abrupt, but it's painted with brushes, and behind him on the wall is a landscape by a friend of his, a kind of humanizing attribute of his trade. His face is less challenging, perhaps even more quizzical. His development as a portrait painter doesn't proceed in a straight line. He experiments on his friends. One of those was a modest customs official with great taste, Victor Choquet, who became Cézanne's most avid collector and was well known in the Impressionist circle. Cézanne and several of his contemporaries painted his portrait. I have a little exercise for you. To look at these three portraits of Choquet, made a year or two apart, and decide which you prefer, which is by Cézanne. No winners, no prizes, no hurry. Okay, I hear murmuring. Complaints, probably. So we won't tally the results. Sorry, we'll just put the labels up. You could hardly find a bigger contrast than Renoir's delicate portrait at the left. I think the soulful directness in the eyes, the delicate fingers, the intimacy, even with the painting behind him. Renoir's weave of small touches for the fabric and the feathery strokes for his hair, all of that gives Choquet a sympathetic kind of refinement. It's worth comparing the two by Cézanne up close. On the left, Choquet gets a longer face, kind of abstracted expression, and hair that's thick with heavy buildup of paint. On the right, that surface agitation is gone, and the thinner paint, which he applies very patiently, may suggest something of what Cézanne said about Choquet and about himself. He said, "I'm struck by his serenity. Faith has not endowed me with an equal stability, which is the only regret I have about things in this earth." This applies, I think, also to the small portrait of Choquet at home, in his slippers, at ease, in a casual pose, surrounded by his furniture and his paintings. You've seen that Cézanne, working alongside his kindly mentor, Pissarro, he absorbed Impressionist light and color, while Pissarro absorbed something of Cézanne's originality as a composer. Here, Cézanne has an amazing idea. The expression is similar to what we saw before, but he's had a haircut and he's put himself in front of wallpaper with great big Rococo pattern on a polite pink behind him. And Cézanne paints that pattern roughly, impatiently, as though he were signaling, even acting out some of his own bottled up energy. The gentle colors may reflect Pissarro's civilizing influence, but there was another person with some influence in these same years, Cézanne's companion and wife-to-be, Hortense Fiquet. Like Cézanne, Hortense was from the Provences, in her case, the Jura in eastern France, from a respectable family, several rungs down the social ladder from Cézanne's. She had worked as a bookbinder and had a flair for clothes. And by now, they'd had a 5-year-old son, Paul. She sits in the huge wing armchair in their Paris apartment, comfortable in her pose, leaning on one arm, looking in the general direction of the artist, but not focusing, seeming lost in thought. Her face may not tell us much about her personality, and her expression might leave us wondering about their relationship, which proved actually to be durable. And Hortense was a patient and reliable model for countless long sessions. She sat for nearly 30 portraits. Each of them would typically take many sittings. She was a working partner of his. She gave Cézanne the opportunity to refine his techniques of rendering delicate colors, skin tones, and costume. Do you see how her face is delicately modeled in flat planes? You look at her chin, look at the highlights everywhere. But maybe the most amazing thing is the skirt she wears. It is made of rippling bands and limpid stripes, each one gently mottled like watercolor in muted greens and grays and blues. It gets the effect of shiny alternating with matte. There's a light ground underneath that he leaves unpainted to form highlights. And all in all, it's a gorgeous and sympathetic portrait and a display of virtuosity that doesn't make a show of itself, but by its technique, creates new possibilities for oil paint. Her gentle lean to one side is a device that Cézanne uses in many other portraits of Hortense. A kind of calculated imbalance, in fact, is what makes this life-size portrait of a dozen years later just so wonderfully strange. He's turned her chair a bit away from the wall. Behind her, the dark chair rail dips down on a diagonal in the direction of her gentle lean, but the rail is discontinuous on either side of her. In fact, the surroundings are all a bit askew or afloat, like the mirror at the upper left in a gilt frame above the fireplace, which we only recognize as a fireplace because it has those tongs propped up next to it. The heavy curtain has no visible means of support. So we're obviously not expected to take this as an accurate rendition of the interior. But are these devices suggesting something about her maybe? Maybe that she's a steadying force, despite her own slight tilt, in an otherwise unsteady household? D.H. Lawrence wrote that by making her still, The artist, and this is a quote, starts making the universe slip uneasily about her. It was part of his desire to make the human form, the life form, come to rest. Not static, on the contrary, mobile, but come to rest. And at the same time, he set the unmoving material world into motion. There are 29 paintings. This fell off, I've got to put it on me, sorry. Okay. I think this is how it goes. Here comes Carl. Yes. Great, thank you. There are 29 paintings of Hortense in existence, most of them quite different in size and in finish and how she looks. 10 years ago, the Met had a marvelous exhibition on the subject of Madame Cézanne. Charlotte Hale, the paintings conservator at the Met, wrote this in the catalog about visitors to the show. They asked, she said, why does she look so sad, so bored, frankly, so odd? They wonder, why do her eyes look blank? Why are her hands unfinished? Why does she appear to be tipping over? And what exactly was going on between the artist and his model? Hale's answer is that Cézanne what he was doing was recalibrating the relationship of what he saw, the subject, the motif, and how it could be expressed on canvas. What Cézanne said about his job as a painter was to perceive and capture harmony from among many relationships. He must transpose them on a scale of his own invention, while he develops them according to a new and original logic. Hale added, without expectations on either side, Cézanne seems to have felt the freedom to explore this process while painting his wife, using her as a template for experimentation. Her unfinished hands are holding a flower. Do you think any of this could be more vivid or have more meaning if Cézanne had finished the hands and the flower, softened the edges of the floating blue shadows? I doubt it. Hortense was a very good sport. These two paintings hang together at the Philadelphia Museum. Her body language is subtle. The expressions are never smiling, always pensive, sometimes withdrawn, and sometimes, we might think, needy, even imploring. But we need to be careful because it's just too easy to project emotional states on faces of people that we've never seen in the original. Now and then, Cézanne shows her in a way we have to call tender. She shares the sheet of watercolor paper with a bouquet of hydrangeas. Their French name is Hortensia. Now here she sits, stable now on a pyramid of skirt, secure on a little wooden chair, and not in a household full of floating attributes, but inside garden at the family manor at Aix. After Cézanne's father's death a few years earlier, tensions in the family relaxed some, and Hortense was welcome at the Jardin Bouffin. The portrait is not only unusual for its outdoor light, but also for the fact that he made a pencil study of Hortense's head sometime beforehand. The changes are slight, but you can see they're symptomatic. In the painting, the lips are a bit less curvy, and the nose and the eyebrows are treated with straighter lines. Her cowlick is gone to emphasize
the geometric oval of the face. So this is an impressionist subject, the well-dressed woman in a winter garden. Here, by comparison, is Manet, a dozen years earlier, painting a couple who were friends of his, painting them with the best of manners, comme il faut. You've just seen that the background, her surroundings, makes suggestions about her in a new kind of way. In the case of this portrait, the method is different, and it's centuries old. You show the man in his habitat with his work and at work. This is Gustave Geoffroy, who was a new friend in 1895, who published the first profile of Cézanne, who was delighted and grateful for it, and Cézanne offered to paint Geoffroy's portrait. Cézanne had to be thinking not just about a good likeness of Geoffroy, but also the competition from Manet, who'd painted Émile Zola in his study with a display of letters and artistic memorabilia, and competition from Degas, who'd painted another prominent critic, Edmond Duranty, posed in deep thought in his impressive library. Cézanne sort of liberated and animated the background and the still life. He made Geoffroy less stagey and maybe a bit less, maybe look a bit distracted. After 3 months of almost daily sittings, Cézanne apologized to Geoffroy and confessed that he couldn't finish the painting, and he took it back. Now, everything seems to be finished when we see it, except the hands. It's never been clear just why Cézanne wasn't satisfied with it, but he was like that, and he broke with Geoffroy. Word in art circles about Cézanne's extreme slowness did not prevent this man from having his portrait painted, however. His own astute, ambitious art dealer, Ambroise Vollard, who had read Geoffroy's story about Cézanne, and who had a small gallery in a fashionable street, and in 1895 gave Cézanne his first solo exhibition. About 150 paintings that he rotated, selling many of them, some to artists who'd been admirers of Cézanne, like Degas and Monet and Pissarro. Later on, Vollard described his experience to a friend who wrote this. Vollard has been posing every morning at Cézanne's for what seems like forever. As soon as he moves, Cézanne complains that he's made him lose his line of concentration. Vollard recalled how Cézanne reacted one time when he did move. "You wretch! You've spoiled the pose. Do I have to tell you again that you have to sit like an apple? Does an apple move?" Vollard said he sat for 115 sessions, each one beginning at 8 in the morning and lasting until 11:30 at night. That has to be an exaggeration, but it has become part of Cézanne's legend. Joachim Gasquet was a bright 23-year-old friend who'd been taking long walks with Cézanne in Aix and had read kind of a real rapport with him. Cézanne gave him here the kind of tilted pose that we've seen before, the keen expression. But he only gave Gasquet 5 or 6 sittings, and he left the picture unfinished. It gives us a good look at how Cézanne worked. You can see pencil lines under the thinnest first layers. On the forehead, you can see the washy patches of yellow and blue. On the near cheek, a few big curving swoops of pink over a lavender swoop that makes the shadow. Gasquet said, "I thought he'd given it up. Later, I discovered that he'd spent roughly 60 sessions on it. He'd worked on it after I left. He'd been painting from memory." Cézanne almost never got a commission for a portrait or paid wages to models for his figure compositions. This once, though, Vollard hired a teenage Italian boy called Michelangelo de Rosa, and Cézanne made 6 paintings of him, all in different poses and different states of mind, mostly dreamy, even absent or sullen. 2 of them are very beautiful watercolors. And one, the largest of them, the boy in the middle here, has a kind of, wears a hat and has a kind of hip shot pose, the classical contrapposto that comes down to Cézanne through the Renaissance and centuries of life-drawing exercises. An art historian friend of ours wrote a delightful essay about this pose called The Renaissance Elbow that went backwards from Mick Jagger to antiquity. Cézanne studied statues in the Louvre and locally in Aix, and he made very many drawings of poses that never left him all his life. This is a good moment to return to another of Cézanne's old-fashioned interests that never left him, the figurative art of the Renaissance, including history painting and idyllic outdoor subjects. When I was a student in New York, I looked at this painting by Cézanne at the Museum of Modern Art almost every time I came. You couldn't miss it. The curator put it right in the middle of the wall facing you inside the entrance to the modern and contemporary galleries, so it was the first thing you saw. For this installation, he parked John the Baptist by Rodin outside to welcome you to modern art. The label said that the subject had interested Cézanne since his youth. The Barnes collection had the evidence here at the right here, which is this composition of bathers in a river valley with Mont Sainte-Victoire in the distance, a major project that Cézanne had worked on 10 years earlier. In the MoMA bather, he took it up again. But because he hadn't been satisfied with the pose, he had a photographer pose a model and shoot it. And he used this, correcting the head and the legs for his version. Cézanne, of course, had chosen another impressionist subjects, young men swimming out of doors in a landscape. This is by Frédéric Bazille. And it recalled for Cézanne some of the happiest times of his life, hiking around the river valley as a carefree teenager with his fellow schoolboys and skinny dipping. When Vollard asked him to make a color lithograph a dozen years later, Cézanne had many choices that he could have used, but he chose this one, this composition, feeling proud of it. Paul Gauguin, a great admirer of Cézanne, visited the south of France around this time and described Cézanne as a man of the Midi who spends entire days in the mountains reading Virgil and looking at the sky. Therefore, his horizons are high, his blues very intense, and the reds in his work has an astounding vibrancy. He wrote, just like Virgil, who has many meanings and who can be interpreted as one wishes, his work has a metaphorical sense with 2 aims. Its essence is as imaginative as it is realistic. So this idea of Cézanne as a Provençal Virgil, a poet dreaming up fantasy landscapes in modern dress, or no dress, is an idea that generated images that run through Cézanne's work from the start to the finish. Nude bathing is only part of it. To show some of the variety here, the picture at the top left is a bit of a mystery, but seems to have 3 men on the riverbank, including Cézanne himself, in the company of 3 nude women. Real, or are they in the imagination of the men? And below it is a little painting in the galleries here upstairs that has 2 contemporary men and a kind of doll-like 18th century girl, all of them decorous. The one on the right shows a young man who resembles his own 16-year-old son, Paul, maybe daydreaming in the company that he'd like to be keeping, such as the foursome at the top, all in classical poses derived from ancient Greek and Roman statues. Some of his painted fantasies, like the one at the bottom, connect to a puzzling group of earlier pictures of rape, violent murder. Rather than being symptoms of personality disorders, though, as some critics used to argue, those may well have been stimulated by stories that he read as an adolescent in Greek and Latin epics. There was also a lot of explicit violence in contemporary historical fiction by Provençal writers, and that may well have reduced the shock value of Cézanne's images. At this point, let's return to Cézanne's landscapes of the 1880s. His wanderings in the Provençal territory around Aix revealed to his imagination sometimes cabins or farm buildings that had been abandoned or ruined, but were sometimes still lived in. They had an old-fashioned romantic allure for him. And not far from the Bibemos Quarry is an even stranger sight. It's the Château Noir, hardly a chateau, but a big country house, perched up in the valley. It was being built for a local businessman some 40 years before and then abandoned and never finished. Cézanne prowled around making drawings like this and paintings. You see the upper part of the two buildings made of that familiar orangey, reddish sandstone that we've been seeing in the Bibemos Quarry. After Cézanne's father died and his in-laws sold the family property at Aix to the Jacques Buffon in 1889, Cézanne tried to buy the Château Noir, but he couldn't. As he moved around, it could look to him like an actual medieval ruin, with neo-Gothic pointed windows and a massive structure beneath it. It was built below cliffs on a steep slope that was thick with huge pines and oaks and brush. For Cézanne, the trees gave it a spooky flavor, as though they were reaching out to finish the job of pulling down the buildings. Having failed to buy the place, though, he rented a room in what was left of the building, this little stone cabin at the top, a place to stash the painting equipment and unfinished works. In the courtyard, there was an elderly pistachio tree that he studied in one of his most beautiful watercolors. He set about exploring the rocky grounds where there were some abandoned relics of earlier times. Here, a big cistern in the middle and a millstone at the left, both cylindrical shapes that Cézanne often spotted in the landscape. The cistern again at the far left, now with a huge gray limestone boulder that's landed between the red rock of the ground and the steep slope behind it. I think Cézanne's composition must have fed his thoughts about time and sequence. The cistern, after all, was a way of ingenious humans, and is, ingenious humans to survive in arid places. At some point, the boulder invaded this little bit of level ground, and now it's as though it were behind bars, restrained, ironically, by the young trees. The boulder stays put. The slender trees all around it have branches making sort of joyous arcs of green. There's an equilibrium here. There are rocky caves under the outcrops above the chateau that Cézanne studied in watercolors and oil paintings like this one. His friend, the geologist and paleontologist Marion, had discovered prehistoric relics in caves nearby. For Cézanne, knowing that their ancient human history, knowing that had to give these rocks some special interest. Here the trees bend before the overarching mass of rock, which has moved in the past. You can see the boulders at the bottom, and let them grow tall and spread their canopy and thrive. The painting on the right here is one of the greatest of all. Now the colors are abbreviated into large translucent patches like watercolor, and the opposing forces, rocks on one side, trees on the other, seem to be in equilibrium. The curator Françoise Cachin quoted Henri Matisse, who owned this picture, on Cézanne's colors. He applied some blue to make his yellow sing, but he used it with the discernment that was characteristic of Cézanne on every occasion, him and him alone. He said about Cézanne, he had among the greatest artists the merit of trying to give to his task of painting its highest mission, to make his colors forces in a picture. Forces for sure. Add to them the elemental drama of what Cézanne chooses to paint. Here's an example of that drama. Cézanne made a series of studies in watercolor of various struggles between rocks and trees. John Rewald tried to retrace Cézanne's steps at the Château Noir and went around with his camera and found some of the ledges and trees that Cézanne had painted 30 years earlier. Now, another favorite object of study for Cézanne had always been sculpture. And the more Baroque, the more physically expressive the figures, the better for him. Here at the left in the Louvre is the abduction group by a hero of Cézanne's, the great sculptor Pierre Puget. Cézanne made several drawings of it, never too old at the age of 40 to learn. It's been suggested that for Cézanne, these rocks and slender pines, these struggles in extreme slow motion of force and resistance, of brute power and beauty, suggest human entanglement through the zigzag forms of the trees and the limbs thrown out, the aggressor leaning back, nature as struggle. When he was well past 60, working hard in the studio at figure compositions and going off to paint views of the valley and the distant mountains, Cézanne would still come back here, come back to the Château Noir and hike around and find new angles to draw and paint. He was still stretching his amazing powers of suggestion. And you feel having intimations of mortality. Well, please come back next time and look at the late work with me and see what I mean. Thank you.